For nearly 50 years, fans believed they knew the real story behind the two Melissas. But at 61, Melissa Gilbert finally breaks her silence, and the truth about her childhood sister is nothing like anyone imagined. What if the very first decision made about your life wasn't in your own hands, yet it shaped everything that followed? Melissa Gilbert's life began exactly like that. Her biological parents, David Darlington and Kathy Wood, were young, struggling, and unsure how they would raise a child. They faced real problems: financial pressure, emotional instability, and no steady foundation. They knew they loved their baby, but they also knew love alone wasn't enough to give her the life she deserved. After many difficult talks and painful moments, they chose something incredibly hard for any parent to do. They decided to place their newborn daughter for adoption. It was a heartbreaking choice, but they believed it was the kindest and most responsible one they could offer. They hoped she would have a life filled with chances they couldn't provide. That decision led to a huge change just one day after Melissa was born. She was adopted by Paul Gilbert, an actor with years of experience, and his wife, Barbara Crane, who was an actress and dancer. Barbara also came from a famous family. Her father was Harry Crane, a well-known comedy writer who helped shape classic television. From the start, Melissa entered a world that was very different from most children's lives. Instead of quiet, private surroundings, she was raised in a home where cameras, scripts, rehearsals, and show business energy were normal. She grew up hearing stories about famous writers and actors, watching her parents prepare for roles, and learning the rhythm of a Hollywood family. Even as a baby, people around her noticed she had something special in her personality. She was expressive, curious, and comfortable around adults. She watched everything closely, reacted in ways that showed she might have a natural connection to performing. Her parents never pushed her, but they quickly saw she enjoyed being part of the lively atmosphere around her. She was outgoing, friendly, and brave, even at a young age. But beyond the surface of glamour, Melissa was also building her inner world. She grew up with Jewish customs because her adoptive family practiced them, even though she was never formally converted. She celebrated holidays, learned the values of the tradition, and carried those lessons with her. Still, there were quiet questions she held inside. She knew she was adopted, and that knowledge made her wonder about who she truly was and where she really came from. She felt loved, but she also felt a soft, unspoken confusion about identity feelings many adopted children experience without fully understanding. Her early home life also changed sooner than she expected. When she was 8 years old, her adoptive parents divorced. The split shook her sense of stability and made her feel the loss of a family structure she thought would always stay the same. Watching her parents separate added another layer to her questions about belonging. She had already faced the idea of two families, her biological and adoptive ones, and now she had to adjust to a fractured home as well. These experiences shaped how she learned to cope, how she formed relationships, and how she understood herself. After the divorce, her mother eventually remarried, bringing new people and new emotions into Melissa's life. This period made her think even more deeply about where she fit. Was she defined by her biological roots, her adoptive family, or the complicated mixture of both? She carried these questions quietly while growing up in the spotlight, which only made them harder to answer. Being watched by millions meant she often felt more seen than understood, more recognized than truly known. This feeling would follow her for years, and later play a part in the way she viewed her relationships, including the one with Melissa Sue Anderson. Even though her childhood looked bright and exciting from the outside, Melissa had already lived through several emotional storms by the time she reached her early school years. She experienced separation on many levels, first from her birth parents, then from her adoptive parents' marriage breaking apart. At the same time, she was being raised in a world where appearance, performance, and public expectations mattered. People saw the smiling child in front of cameras, not the little girl asking herself, "Who am I really? And where do I truly belong?" These early experiences shaped how she reacted to people, how quickly she formed attachments, and how deeply she felt disappointment. They also influenced how she understood friendship. Loyalty, trust, and connection were things she valued strongly, but she had already learned that even people you love can leave or change. This quiet understanding stayed with her as she moved into a career that demanded constant emotional openness. It also became a hidden part of the way she viewed other young actors around her. Growing up in a showbiz household gave her opportunities many children never dream of, but it also meant she lived under a type of pressure most adults struggle with. She was expected to be sweet, well-behaved, talented, and professional, even before she fully understood what those expectations meant. She had to learn quickly, adjust constantly, and carry a level of maturity unusual for someone so young. Even her early glimpses of talent came with responsibility. If she could perform well, people around her wanted to guide her toward more roles. If she made a mistake, it felt magnified in a world where reputation mattered. But despite everything happening around her, Melissa kept showing the same natural spark that caught her adoptive parents' attention. She liked storytelling, she enjoyed entertaining others, and she had the kind of screen presence that couldn't be taught. Her early childhood was shaping her for a future she couldn't even imagine yet, one that would make her a household name. Still, underneath all the bright lights and open doors, a quieter truth lived inside her. She was a child searching for a sense of stability and belonging, trying to understand her place in a world that demanded so much from her at such a young age. These emotions would stay with her as she stepped into the biggest role of her life. But long before she met Melissa Sue Anderson, another tragedy would strike, one that would change the course of her childhood forever. How do you keep acting like a normal child when everything in your world is breaking apart? Melissa Gilbert faced this question much earlier than most children ever should. When she was only 11 years old, her adoptive father, Paul Gilbert, suddenly passed away. He had been the steady, loving presence in her life, the person who encouraged her talent and made her feel safe in a world that often felt too big for a little girl. His death left a deep emptiness inside her. Melissa adored him, and losing him at such a young age created a sadness she didn't know how to express. She was expected to smile, perform, and behave like a cheerful child, but inside she was grieving the loss of the man she saw as her real father. Nothing felt the same after that day. As Melissa processed this heartbreak, her home life changed again. Her mother, Barbara, remarried, and this brought a new stepfather into the house. It also brought a baby sister into Melissa's life, Sarah, born in 1975, who would later become known to the world as Sarah Gilbert. Although Melissa loved having a baby in the family, the shift in household dynamics added new layers of change she needed to adjust to. She was still dealing with the loss of her father, still trying to understand why life kept shifting around her, and now she was learning to accept a new family structure. Instead of slowing down to heal, she had to keep moving, keep adjusting, and keep performing. During this emotional time, Melissa continued working, mostly in commercials. Some children would have broken down under so much pressure, but Melissa poured her energy into performing. One of her most memorable early jobs was a commercial for Alpo dog food, where she acted alongside Lorne Greene, the famous actor from Bonanza. Despite her grief, Melissa showed surprising discipline. She arrived on set, ready to work, listened carefully to instructions, and paid attention to how the adults around her behaved. These early experiences taught her how to be professional, even when her heart felt heavy. Being on set became a strange kind of escape. It gave her something firm to hold on to when everything else in her life felt unstable. This is something many child actors go through without anyone noticing. They learn how to hide their pain, how to smile even when they're hurting, and how to separate their real emotions from the characters they play. Melissa didn't have the language at the time to explain it, but she was already learning the skill of performing through pain. Cameras don't care if a child is grieving. Auditions don't stop for emotional wounds. And Hollywood doesn't slow down for broken hearts. Melissa adapted because she had to. Acting became both her shield and her survival tool. This emotional strength played a huge role in the moment that changed her life. The audition for Little House on the Prairie. The casting call was massive. More than 500 young girls auditioned for the role of Laura Ingalls, a character who would become one of television's most beloved daughters. Melissa didn't show off, didn't overact, didn't try to force charm. Instead, she walked into the audition with a natural warmth, a sincere smile, and a grounded presence. She didn't know it then, but Michael Landon and the producers were looking for exactly that. They wanted someone who felt real, someone who looked like a child the audience could connect with emotionally. Melissa's simplicity and honesty stood out. After the auditions, Melissa waited for news, not knowing whether she had been chosen or forgotten. The answer came from an unexpected source. Leslie Landon, Michael Landon's daughter, who was in her school. One day, Leslie casually mentioned that her father said Melissa got the part. This was how she learned that she had been chosen for a role that would define her childhood and change her life forever. It was a surreal moment for her, especially because she was too young to understand how big this opportunity really was. She only knew that she was excited and that something important was about to happen. Soon after, her younger brother Jonathan Gilbert also joined the cast as Willie Ollison. Having her brother on set made things feel a little safer, a little more familiar, especially when she already felt so much emotional confusion. She was entering a huge professional world, surrounded by adults, cameras, and expectations. Having Jonathan next to her softened some of the pressure. When filming began, Melissa stepped onto the set of Little House on the Prairie and entered a new chapter of her life. Everything felt large and lively. The costumes, the cameras, the long hours, and the adults who had already worked in the industry for years. She was meeting her on-screen family for the first time. She felt welcomed by Michael Landon, Karen Grassel, and the rest of the cast, who treated her with kindness and patience. And then she met Melissa Sue Anderson, the young actress who played her older sister, Mary Ingalls. Melissa Sue was calm, quiet, and more serious than Melissa Gilbert. She carried herself differently, more reserved, more private. To Melissa, who was open, expressive, and still emotionally raw, Melissa Sue felt a bit distant. Not unfriendly, just different. Their personalities didn't immediately blend, and Melissa sensed that this on-screen sisterhood wouldn't feel exactly the same off-screen. Still, they were two young girls, close in age, both doing a job that demanded long hours and high emotional energy. They shared school hours, scenes, rehearsals, and the pressure of being in a hit show. They respected each other's talent, but even in those early days, there was an unspoken sense of difference between them. Not conflict, just a quiet distance. Melissa didn't fully understand yet. As she settled into her role, Melissa threw herself into work with the same determination she used to survive her personal losses. Acting became her steady place, the one area she could control. She didn't realize at the time that this set, these people, and these early relationships would shape her for years to come. But what Melissa didn't know then was that her new on-screen sister would also become one of the most complex relationships of her entire life. What really happens to children when millions of people watch them grow up, but no one truly sees what they feel inside? For Melissa Gilbert, Little House on the Prairie was not just a TV show, it became her entire childhood. Every weekday followed almost the same pattern. She woke up early, got into costume, went through makeup, and headed straight to set school before filming. The workday was long. Scenes were repeated again and again until the director was happy. There were emotional scenes, freezing outdoor days, hot summer shoots, and hours of waiting for lighting or camera setups. For most kids, childhood is filled with free time, hobbies, and playing with friends. For Melissa, it was filled with scripts, marks on the ground, and learning how to cry on cue. She didn't complain, but the truth was that she was growing up under a pressure she never fully understood at the time. Michael Landon became a huge part of her life, and his influence shaped her both as an actress and as a person. He was warm, funny, strict, and extremely professional. On set, he expected focus and discipline from everyone, even the children. Melissa admired him deeply. She looked at him as a father figure, especially after losing her adoptive dad. Michael's emotional presence on set set the tone for everything. If he was happy, the atmosphere felt light and playful. If he was stressed, the entire crew walked on eggshells. Melissa learned quickly how to read his moods, how to keep up with his energy, and how to give him the performance he wanted. He taught her how to hit emotional beats, how to stay in character, and how to use her natural personality instead of forcing things. But even with all this love and mentorship, his high expectations added more pressure than any young child could admit at the time. To the audience, Little House looked like a peaceful, warm, family-friendly show filled with lessons, love, and simple life. But behind the camera, the cast worked hard so hard that exhaustion was normal. For children, memorizing lines, staying still for long periods, and constantly being watched by adults was draining. Melissa often finished a long day with sore feet, tired eyes, and a mind full of emotional scenes. But because people saw her as America's sweetheart on screen, no one imagined the exhaustion inside. She had to stay cheerful during interviews, friendly during public events, and perfect during filming. The world fell in love with the Ingalls sisters, but Melissa sometimes felt like she had to hide her real feelings to protect the image everyone expected from her. Child actors working together on a daily basis often form close bonds, but those bonds are not always simple. The pressure creates connections, but it can also create distance. Melissa and the other children on set spent more time together than they spent with kids their own age outside of work. They studied together, ate lunch together, and shared jokes between scenes. But at the same time, each of them dealt with personal stress, family issues, and the weight of fame differently. Some days they played and laughed like normal kids. Other days they pulled away from each other because they were drained, frustrated, or overwhelmed. These shifts were natural, but they sometimes created misunderstandings or quiet emotional gaps that no one talked about. Public expectations made this even harder. Fans saw the girls as perfect children, living perfect pioneer lives. They assumed the cast truly lived like a family and loved each other in real life. They imagined that Melissa and Melissa Sue Anderson were inseparable best friends. But the truth was that off-screen friendships are much more complicated. Melissa felt pressure to stay polite, friendly, and warm with everyone because that was the image the show carried. She didn't want to disappoint fans or producers. At the same time, she was a real child with real emotions, and she sometimes felt frustrated, sensitive, or insecure. These feelings were normal, but she rarely had space to express them. Small frictions developed over the years, the kind that naturally happen when young people work together under intense conditions. There were moments when Melissa felt competition with other children. She wondered if someone else was getting more praise, more attention, or better scenes. She also heard whispers on set about favored children, comments that certain actors were closer to Michael Landon or the producers. Whether those rumors were true or not didn't matter. Children are emotional, and Melissa felt the weight of every quiet comparison. Temperament differences also played a big role. Melissa was open, lively, and expressive. She often wore her heart on her sleeve. Melissa Sue Anderson was quieter, calmer, and more private. These differences created natural distance between them. In their early years together, Melissa admired Melissa Sue. She respected her discipline, her serious approach to acting, and her calm personality. At the same time, she silently compared herself to her. She wondered if she looked as poised, if she acted as professionally, and if people saw her as talented. She never said these thoughts out loud, but they affected how she saw their dynamic. She liked Melissa Sue, but she also felt unsure around her, as if she needed to be careful not to say the wrong thing or act too childish. It was not dislike, it was a quiet insecurity, something many children feel but few can explain. Fans watching the show had no idea about any of this. To them, the Ingalls sisters looked like the closest pair of siblings on American television. Laura and Mary were the picture of perfect sisterhood, supportive, loving, and deeply connected. But behind the scenes, the girls lived very different emotional experiences. They respected each other deeply, but they were not the inseparable best friends people imagined. Their personalities didn't naturally blend in a close way, and both girls were dealing with their own personal struggles that viewers could never see. Melissa often felt torn between being a child and being a professional, between being herself and being what the world expected. Every scene they filmed, every episode they shot, and every interview they gave slowly added layers to their relationship. Years passed, and the audience kept believing they knew the real story. But Melissa carried feelings she never spoke, about feelings shaped by loss, pressure, admiration, insecurity, and the unique challenges of growing up on camera. Because while America saw two perfect little girls, Melissa knew the truth was far more complicated. What happens when the world refuses to let you grow up, but your life keeps pushing you forward anyway? That was the struggle Melissa Gilbert faced as she moved from a child star into her teenage years. Most kids go through awkward phases, privately, learning who they are with time, mistakes, and privacy. But Melissa lived every stage of her growth, while millions of people watched her on television, compared her to others, and expected her to stay the same sweet little girl from Little House on the Prairie. The world wanted Laura Ingalls to stay young and innocent. But Melissa was growing up fast, carrying emotional wounds from her childhood and trying to understand who she really was outside of her famous character. Once Little House became a hit, Melissa's talent caught the attention of producers and directors who saw potential far beyond her role as Laura. She began transitioning into more serious acting projects, which came with bigger expectations and even heavier emotional demands. One of her first major steps into dramatic territory was The Miracle Worker, where she played Helen Keller. This wasn't a light, easy role. It required emotional depth, physical effort, and the ability to show pain, frustration, and transformation. Melissa impressed everyone with her dedication. She threw herself into the work, even though she was still just a young girl trying to navigate her own complicated life. The role earned her respect, but it also pushed her to grow up faster than she was ready for. From there, she took on The Diary of Anne Frank, another emotionally heavy project that required her to connect with themes of fear, loss, and hope. These roles were far from the playful, innocent moments she had experienced earlier in her career. She was being asked to carry stories of suffering and bravery, becoming the emotional center of intense productions. She did not fully understand how much this would affect her inner world. Performing such deep emotions forced her to step into a maturity she had not naturally reached yet. Then came Splendor in the Grass, where she played a young woman dealing with heartbreak, desire, and emotional breakdown. This role pushed her even further into adulthood. The story dealt with subjects like mental health, passion, and societal pressure. Melissa had to explore emotional areas she had never personally lived through, relying on instinct and training to deliver believable performances. She was praised for her work, but deep inside, she still felt the confusion of a young girl caught between her childhood identity and new adult expectations. One of her most powerful roles was in Choices of the Heart, where she played the real-life humanitarian John Donovan, who was killed in El Salvador. This project required Melissa to understand real-world danger, sacrifice, and courage. She researched Donovan's life and tried to honor her memory with honesty. The role left a strong mark on Melissa. It showed her the seriousness of acting, but it also added another emotional weight to a heart that was already carrying more than most young people ever experience. Despite all these achievements, Melissa struggled with her own identity. Being known worldwide as Laura Ingalls made it hard for people to see her as anything else. She felt trapped between who she was as a person and who she was expected to be. No matter how hard she worked, some viewers and producers still saw her as the sweet pioneer girl and not as an adult actress with range. This typecasting made her question her worth and her abilities. She wanted to grow, but the world wanted her to stay the same. This was a time when comparisons became stronger too, especially between her and Melissa Sue Anderson. As they got older, their approaches to fame began moving in different directions. Melissa Sue was more private, more controlled, and more distant from the spotlight. Melissa Gilbert, on the other hand, was open, emotional, and more connected to public attention. Their different styles made people compare them unfairly. Some said Melissa Sue was the serious one, while others said Melissa was the heart of the show. These comparisons annoyed both actresses and slowly created more emotional space between them. Media attention made everything harder. Reporters often asked Melissa about her looks, her relationships, her weight, or her future plans, even when she was still a teenager. Every decision she made was judged publicly. If she changed her hairstyle, people commented. If she gained or lost a little weight, magazines wrote about it. She was expected to look perfect, behave perfectly, and carry herself like a grown woman, even though she had barely entered adulthood. These pressures made her feel even more lost. She was trying to find herself, but the world kept interrupting. Meanwhile, Melissa's emotional wounds from her childhood loss, insecurity, pressure, and the need to be perfect began growing inside her. She wanted independence. She wanted to be herself without the weight of Laura Ingalls on her shoulders. She wanted people to see Melissa, not the character she played. But letting go of a role that defined her childhood felt impossible. She was grateful for Little House, yet she also felt trapped by it. This internal conflict followed her everywhere. Inside the industry, people also quietly compared her to Melissa Sue Anderson. Some said Melissa was more natural. Others said Melissa Sue was more polished. But these outside opinions only added stress. Their teen years weren't spent competing for fun. They were spent being compared by adults who didn't realize the impact their words had. Add the pressure of long workdays, constant public attention, and personal emotional struggles, and the distance between the two girls continued to grow quietly. This is why child star friendships rarely end in big fights. They usually fade quietly. Kids in Hollywood grow under enormous pressure. They don't have normal childhoods. They don't get to form friendships in private. Every interaction is influenced by work, media, expectations, and fatigue. Melissa and Melissa Sue didn't grow apart because of dislike. They grew apart because they had very different personalities, different ways of coping, and different emotional needs. Their lives moved in different directions, and neither of them had the space or freedom to build a simple, carefree friendship. As Melissa stepped deeper into adulthood, she finally started discovering her own voice, her own emotions, and her own dreams outside of the character she played for so long. But the more she grew, the more she realized that the price of fame during childhood was much higher than anyone had prepared her for. But as Melissa found her own voice, she also discovered that the cost of fame during childhood was far greater than anyone had warned her. You can survive fame, you can survive pressure, but can you survive your own heart? Melissa Gilbert learned this lesson not from Hollywood, but from the relationships that shaped her adult life. When she entered her early 20s, She carried years of emotional weight, childhood loss, non-stop work, public expectations, and the pressure of always being America's sweetheart. She longed for love, comfort, and stability, but she also carried insecurities that she didn't fully understand yet. This made her step into her first marriage with more emotion than clarity. Her relationship with Bo Brinkman began with intense passion and excitement. He was charming, unpredictable, and full of energy. Melissa was young, hopeful, and eager to build a future of her own. The relationship moved quickly, fueled by strong feelings and a shared desire to start a new chapter. But passion is not always the same as stability. Their marriage was emotional, messy, and full of ups and downs. Both were dealing with personal pressures and career struggles, and their strong personalities often clashed. Melissa wanted a solid foundation she never truly had growing up, but Bo was not the partner who could give her that consistency. Their connection burned bright, but also burned fast, and after 6 years, the marriage ended in divorce. The divorce left Melissa feeling disappointed and shaken. She didn't just lose a partner, she lost the idea of what she hoped marriage would be. She had gone into the relationship searching for healing, but instead, she walked away with more questions about love, trust, and her own emotional needs. She carried this pain quietly, the same way she had carried so many emotional struggles in her life. And once again, she had to rebuild herself while the public watched every step. Not long after, she met Bruce Boxleitner, an actor known for his strong presence and steady personality. Their relationship offered something different: shared careers, shared responsibilities, and a blend of families that required patience and understanding. Bruce brought a sense of maturity and calmness into her life. Melissa admired his confidence and stability, and she worked hard to build a family that could grow together over time. Their marriage lasted 16 years, filled with career highs, parenting challenges, public appearances, and the complicated balance of life in the spotlight. They tried to support each other through work stress, personal struggles, and the demands of raising children while being public figures. But even in this long marriage, Melissa carried parts of herself that had never fully healed. She was still learning who she was outside of the roles she played both on screen and in her relationships. Bruce had his own strong personality and career demands, and over time, they found themselves drifting apart. Their separation was not explosive, but painful in a quiet, heavy way. When the marriage ended, Melissa faced another round of emotional fallout. She had spent nearly 2 decades trying to build a lasting partnership, only to find herself starting over again. During these chapters of marriage, divorce, and emotional rebuilding, Melissa's connection with Melissa Sue Anderson was faint at best. Their lives had separated years earlier. Their personalities were different, their careers moved in different directions, and neither of them had the time or emotional space to keep in touch. Anderson lived a far more private life, stepping back from Hollywood and keeping her personal world tightly protected. Melissa Gilbert lived the opposite way. Public interviews, new projects, writing, acting, and raising a blended family. Because they weren't seen together, the media began creating its own stories. Rumors of a feud slowly grew. People assumed that the distance meant something dramatic had happened between them, but the truth was simpler and more human. They were 2 women with different lives, different emotional needs, and different ways of coping with fame. There was no big fight, no betrayal, and no hatred. Just silence, years passing, and lives moving forward separately. Still, Melissa often wondered about their connection. Was the distance caused by misunderstandings from childhood? Was it their opposite personalities? Or was it simply emotional protection, 2 young girls who survived fame differently and needed space to grow? These questions stayed with Melissa as she matured. She never blamed Anderson. Instead, she slowly understood that some relationships drift because life pulls people in separate directions. The world may have wanted a simple answer: best friends or enemies, but their real relationship lived somewhere in between. By the time Melissa reached her 40 seconds and 50 seconds, her emotional maturity deepened. She began to see her past relationships with clearer eyes. She learned to set boundaries, understand her needs, and accept that not every connection has to last forever to be meaningful. She realigned her values, focusing on stability, honesty, and peace, rather than trying to fit into the role that others expected from her. She worked on healing the wounds she carried since childhood loss, pressure, identity struggles, and the hidden weight of growing up on camera. She learned that real peace doesn't come from fame or relationships. It comes from understanding yourself. She didn't know it yet, but just as she began to feel grounded and emotionally balanced, life was about to shift again. A new chapter was waiting for her, one that would change her direction once more and bring unexpected transformation into her world. And just when she thought she had found peace, life pushed her into a chapter she never expected. What if the role you were born to play wasn't on television, but in the second half of your own life? After years of carrying the weight of childhood fame, public pressure, and complicated emotions, Melissa Gilbert slowly began building a new version of herself, one based not on the expectations of Hollywood, but on her own choices. Reinvention didn't happen all at once. It came through small steps, new risks, surprising opportunities, and a growing desire to finally understand who she truly was beyond in the characters she played. One of her first major steps was founding her own production company, Half Pint Productions. The name was a warm nod to her famous nickname on Little House on the Prairie, but the purpose behind the company was far more serious. Melissa wanted creative control. She wanted to choose meaningful projects, support stories she believed in, and give herself a voice not limited to acting. For years, she had been part of other people's visions. With her own company, she could shape the narrative instead of being shaped by it. This decision marked a turning point. It showed that she was no longer just the actress. People grew up watching. She was becoming a storyteller, a producer, and a leader. Soon after, she returned to the world that first made her famous, but in a completely different way. Melissa joined the stage musical adaptation of Little House on the Prairie, playing Caroline Ingalls' Ma. This was a full-circle moment that held deep emotional meaning. She stepped into the shoes of the woman who guided and comforted Laura on screen, and she did it at a time when she wanted more grounding and emotional softness in her own life. Performing in the musical reminded her of her roots, but it also showed how much she had grown. She wasn't the little girl anymore. She was a mature woman with decades of experience, losses, victories, and wisdom. Audiences loved seeing her on stage, and for Melissa, the experience felt like reconnecting with a part of herself she had left behind long ago. Then came a new challenge she never expected: ballroom dancing. When Melissa joined Dancing with the Stars in 2012, she pushed herself into a world far outside her comfort zone. The training was intense, the competition was physically demanding, and she was still dealing with old injuries and emotional stress. But she worked hard, learned quickly, and surprised people with her determination. Dancing required vulnerability and courage, and Melissa showed both. Even when she faced falls, pain, and tough judges, she didn't quit. The show reminded her what it felt like to struggle publicly, to be judged, and to keep going anyway. It was another kind of growth, one that tested her body and spirit. Her biggest risk came a few years later, when she made a decision no one expected. She announced her run for Congress in Michigan's 8th District. This was not a publicity stunt or a temporary idea. Melissa genuinely wanted to help people. She cared about families, communities, and the issues affecting everyday lives. Running for office meant putting her entire reputation on the line. It meant exposing herself to political criticism, media attacks, and harsh judgment. People questioned her motives, her seriousness, even her background. But Melissa believed in her ability to make a difference. She knew she had a platform, and she wanted to use it for something meaningful. Her political run didn't last long, though, because her health collapsed. Old spinal injuries resurfaced, causing severe complications that made it impossible to continue the campaign. She had to withdraw, not because she lost passion, but because her body simply couldn't carry the heavy demands. It was disappointing, but also eye-opening. Melissa realized she had spent decades pushing herself emotionally, mentally, and physically, while ignoring her own needs. Stepping back from politics felt like another loss, but it also forced her to slow down, reassess her life, and think about what truly mattered. This period of change prepared her for the most stable and grounded chapter of her life. In 2013, Melissa married Timothy Busfield, an actor and director known for his calm nature, humor, and steady presence. Their relationship was different from anything she had experienced before. There was no chaos, no emotional roller coaster, no pressure to perform. They supported each other's dreams, shared simple routines, and built a peaceful life. Together, they moved away from Hollywood and embraced a quieter lifestyle, gardening, cooking, community projects, and enjoying everyday moments. This marriage allowed Melissa to breathe, reflect, and finally feel safe enough to look back at her past honestly. As she entered her 60 seconds, Melissa began to understand her childhood in a way she never could before. The emotional wounds, the confusion, the pressure, the relationships, all of it became clearer with age. She finally had the distance to see what she went through and the strength to talk about it without fear or hesitation. She wasn't speaking as a child star anymore. She was speaking as a grown woman who had lived through love, loss, fame, heartbreak, motherhood, and healing. This clarity made her feel ready to address the questions people had carried for decades, including her complicated relationship with Melissa Sue Anderson. She knew fans were curious. She knew the public had created stories, imagined drama, and filled in the silence with their own ideas. But Melissa wanted to tell the truth, not the dramatic version, not the exaggerated rumors, but the human story behind two girls who grew up together under intense circumstances. Reaching this age gave her perspective. She could finally see which parts of her past were misunderstandings, which were emotional reactions, and which were never spoken about because she didn't have the maturity to explain them earlier. And she knew that telling her story honestly meant addressing the one relationship people always asked about, the one connection that had been misunderstood for decades. She had avoided it for years, but now, with age and peace behind her, she felt strong enough to share what really happened. Because, as she entered her 60 seconds, Melissa realized there was one story left untold, one that the world had misunderstood for decades. What if the truth wasn't a feud, but something far more human? For decades, people assumed Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson either loved each other deeply or secretly hated each other. Fans created stories, magazines added fuel, and the silence between the two actresses was treated like proof of drama. But when Melissa finally opened up at 61, she made something very clear. They were not enemies, they were not rivals, and they were not best friends. The truth lived somewhere in the middle, somewhere quiet, complicated, and shaped by the strange world they grew up in. Melissa explained that growing up on Little House on the Prairie meant growing up under pressure most children never experience. They were young girls working long hours, expected to act like adults while still learning who they were inside. This environment created misunderstandings that neither of them had the maturity to talk about back then. There were moments of jealousy, normal childhood jealousy, that gets magnified in a competitive industry. There were moments of insecurity, especially when comparisons were made by adults on set, the media, and fans. And there were moments of emotional distance that came from having different personalities, not from resentment. Melissa Sue Anderson was naturally private. She was quiet, disciplined, and more reserved. She often kept her feelings to herself and focused intensely on her work. She approached acting with seriousness and thoughtful preparation. She wasn't the type to open up quickly or share her personal world easily. Melissa Gilbert, on the other hand, was expressive, emotional, and open-hearted. She was talkative, playful, and quick to bond with people. Their personalities were almost opposites, and two children with such different temperaments don't always connect deeply, especially when the environment around them is stressful. Fans saw two perfect sisters on screen, so they assumed that the actresses behind them must have had the same bond in real life. But TV families are not real families. Childhood friendships formed on a set don't always follow normal patterns. Kids working under pressure often react differently than they would in ordinary life. Sometimes they cling to each other, and sometimes they quietly drift apart. For Melissa and Melissa Sue, drifting wasn't a sign of dislike. It was simply two girls coping in their own ways. Melissa admits now that she misunderstood some things back then. As a child, she sometimes saw Anderson's quietness as distance. She didn't realize that Anderson's private nature wasn't rejection. It was simply who she was. At that age, Melissa didn't have the emotional understanding to see the situation clearly. She took silence personally, not realizing it was just Melissa Sue's way of handling work and fame. With time, she learned that not everyone expresses connection the same way. Emotional closeness doesn't always look obvious, and emotional distance doesn't always mean tension. The reason so many people believed they disliked each other was because the two young actresses rarely spent free time together off-screen. They weren't seen at events side by side, and they didn't share the same friend groups. In Hollywood, this is often interpreted as rivalry or conflict. In reality, it was simply two children surviving in the intense, pressured world of early fame. They respected each other's talent, but didn't have the same emotional needs or similar social styles. Their quiet distance was never about anger, it was about personality. Now, at 61, Melissa sees their dynamic with a level of clarity she never had as a child or young adult. She has nothing but respect for Melissa Sue Anderson. She describes her as talented, disciplined, and strong. She appreciates the quality Anderson brought to her work and how seriously she took her role. Melissa also feels gratitude for the years they shared, for the lessons she learned, and for the fact that they were part of something iconic that touched millions of lives. She can now look back, without the confusion, insecurity, or emotional fog of childhood. Time gave her understanding. One thing Melissa wants people to understand is that the world often romanticizes childhood friendships on set. People imagine kids spending every moment together, sharing secrets, giggling between scenes, and growing up like siblings. But the truth is very different. The pressure of performing, the long hours, the constant attention from adults, and the lack of normal childhood experiences often prevent deep friendships from forming. Children in Hollywood bond in unique ways, and many of those bonds fade quietly, not because something went wrong, but because the environment itself makes emotional closeness complicated. So why did Melissa wait so many years to talk openly about her relationship with Anderson? Partly because she needed emotional maturity to understand it herself, partly because she didn't want to feed gossip, disrespect anyone, or add drama to a story that was never dramatic, and partly because she wanted to speak from a place of peace, not confusion or emotional hurt. At 61, she finally felt ready. She wanted to give fans the real story, not the exaggerated version they had built in their minds. Melissa hopes people see her honesty as a reminder that relationships formed in childhood, especially under unusual conditions, don't always fit the simple labels of friends or enemies. Sometimes two people care about each other from a distance. Sometimes they drift apart without any anger. And sometimes the bond they shared still exists quietly, even if it doesn't look the way the world expects. But there is still one final truth Melissa reveals. one that reframes everything we thought we knew about their bond. In the end, what do we carry with us, the fame, the memories, or the relationships that shaped us as children? When Melissa Gilbert reached 61, she finally had the emotional distance to look back at her life with honesty, softness. For the first time, she could see her childhood not as a collection of roles, scripts, and long shooting days, but as a deeply human journey filled with joy, pain, confusion, and growth. Childhood fame had always been a double-edged sword. It gave her opportunities, love from millions of viewers, and a place in television history. But it also took pieces of her childhood away. She worked when other children played, she learned to perform even when she was hurting, and she carried expectations she could never fully escape. At 61, Melissa could finally acknowledge how heavy that pressure had been and how it shaped every chapter of her life afterward. Looking back, she saw the losses she carried from the death of her adoptive father to the emotional distance she sometimes felt, even in crowded rooms. These losses left quiet marks inside her. They made her sensitive, expressive, and emotional. They were wounds she tried to cover with work for many years. But now, with age, she understood that these losses also made her empathetic and strong. They pushed her to care deeply about others, to nurture her family, and to fight for the things she believed in. She didn't see these moments as tragedies anymore. They became part of her identity, part of the story she carried with her into adulthood. Being a mother gave her another layer of understanding. When she had her own children, she finally saw the world through a lens she never had as a young actress. She understood how fragile children are, how deeply they feel, and how much guidance they need. Motherhood helped her understand her own childhood better. It made her realize how vulnerable she had been and how much she had demanded from herself at such a young age. She felt protective of her younger self, almost like a mother looking at her own child. This shift helped her heal many old emotional wounds she had carried silently. She also reflected on success and failure. Her career had high points awards, iconic roles, unforgettable characters, but also moments where she failed publicly. Projects that didn't work, roles that fell flat, personal struggles that became tabloid stories. These could have defined her, but she refused to let them. Aging gave her a new perspective. She no longer measured her worth by fame or public approval. Instead, she valued honesty, peace, family, and emotional clarity. She learned that success is not staying on top forever. It's surviving, evolving, and finding joy in the life you create for yourself. When fans asked for decades whether she and Melissa Sue Anderson disliked each other, Melissa always knew the truth was more delicate than a simple yes or no. At 61, she finally felt ready to give them the emotional answer they deserved, not to feed curiosity, but to offer closure. She wanted fans to know that the tension they sensed wasn't hatred, but the natural result of two young girls growing under extreme pressure. She understood now that neither of them had the ability, at that age, to fully understand the other. They coped differently, reacted differently, and experienced fame differently. She hoped that by telling the truth gently, people would stop expecting childhood relationships to be perfect just because the on-screen story was. Forgiveness played a big role in Melissa's reflections. Not forgiveness toward Anderson, because there was nothing to forgive, but forgiveness toward herself. She forgave herself for misunderstanding things as a child. She forgave herself for feeling insecure, jealous, or unsure. She forgave her younger self for not knowing how to navigate a world that wasn't built for children. She also learned the power of perspective. Time and age helped her see that Anderson wasn't distant to hurt her. She was simply a different kind of person, handling fame in her own quiet way. This understanding softened every memory Melissa held. Melissa now honors Melissa Sue Anderson publicly, not because of pressure, but because she genuinely respects her. She recognizes Anderson's discipline, talent, and dedication. She appreciates how well Anderson carried her role and how much she contributed to the show. Speaking kindly of her isn't an act. It's a reflection of how Melissa's heart has matured over the years. She learned that honoring someone doesn't require being close to them. It only requires understanding and gratitude. If Melissa could talk to her younger self on that set, she would tell her not to worry so much about comparisons or silence or small misunderstandings. She would tell her to focus on the work she loved, to trust her own heart, and to be patient with herself and others. Most of all, she would tell her younger self that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved. That message alone would have eased many of the emotional burdens she carried for years. The truth is, Melissa and Melissa Sue Anderson will always share something unbreakable, childhood lived under extraordinary circumstances. Only a few people in the world know what it's like to grow up on that set, to feel the pressures they felt, and to carry the memories they carry. That shared history is a quiet bond, even if it's not one expressed through constant communication or traditional friendship. It's a connection built from a unique experience that shaped both of their lives forever. Little House on the Prairie touched millions of viewers across generations, and Melissa feels deeply honored to have been part of something that continues to bring comfort, hope, and nostalgia to so many people. She knows the show is bigger than any behind-the-scenes story. Its legacy is one of family, strength, and love values that helped her through many chapters of her own life. At 61, Melissa's reflections form a soft, emotional conclusion, one filled with understanding, forgiveness, and peace. She finally sees her childhood not as a mystery to unlock or a burden to carry, but as a story she lived the best way she could. The relationships, the lessons, the mistakes, and the memories all shaped her into the woman she is today. Because sometimes, the most important truths don't appear in the episodes we film, but in the years we live after the cameras stop.